Rain fell mercilessly over the busy streets of Manila, transforming the asphalt into mirrors that reflected the colorful lights of the city. Manny Pacquiao watched the downpour through the window of his luxurious car, droplets sliding down the glass like tiny tears. He had just left an important meeting at the Philippine Senate, where his work as a politician now occupied much of his days. Memories of the ring still pulsed in his mind, even years after his last fight, that final bout that ended an extraordinary career of 8 world titles in different weight divisions. The driver slowly navigated the flooded streets, avoiding the deep puddles that formed in the imperfections of the asphalt. Manny gently massaged his knuckles, feeling the invisible scars from hundreds of fights, the permanent calluses that told the story of a boy who dropped out of school at 14 to feed his family. That same boy who sold cigarettes on the streets of General Santos City before finding in boxing a way out of the extreme poverty that tormented his existence. The red lights of a traffic signal made the car stop. His eyes wandered over the crowd seeking shelter from the rain, ordinary people running under improvised umbrellas, street vendors trying to protect their merchandise. Pacquiao smiled slightly, remembering how he used to be one of them. Fate had been generous, elevating him from street vendor to global sports icon, from a hungry boy to a senator of his country. Humility never abandoned him. The memories of hunger and struggle never faded from his memory. The traffic light changed, but the car remained motionless for a few seconds. An elderly man was trying to cross the street, walking with difficulty, supported by an improvised cane. His clothes were torn, soaked by the rain that seemed to punish his hunched shoulders even more. Something in the man's gait captured Manny's attention. There was something strangely familiar in the way he moved, even with the apparent difficulty. When the man finally reached the sidewalk, he sat exhausted on a wet bench. Beside him, a small piece of cardboard improvised as a sign had some handwritten words. Manny narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher the message as the car slowly began to move. A sudden understanding made his heart tighten in his chest. Those trembling hands holding the cardboard, that profile partially hidden by the rain. Could they belong to the man who once transformed his life? "Stop the car," Manny ordered the driver, his voice suddenly tense. The driver obeyed immediately, parking the vehicle a few meters ahead. Manny hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle, a strange apprehension taking over his thoughts. The rain fell mercilessly outside, but that wasn't what made him hesitate. It was the possibility that his suspicions were correct. He took a deep breath, grabbed the umbrella from the back seat, and finally got out of the car, facing the downpour that punished the streets of Manila. He slowly approached the elderly man who remained seated on the bench, soaked and trembling. The man kept his gaze down, his wrinkled hands firmly holding the piece of cardboard where faded letters read, "Former boxing trainer, need help for medicine." Manny's heart raced as he recognized, even under the ravages of time and adversity, the face of the man who had taught him his first boxing moves. It was Rodrigo Buenavista, his first trainer, the one who discovered him on the streets of General Santos City when he was just a desperate teenager trying to feed his family. Rodrigo had been the man who put his first gloves on, who taught him to transform his anger and hunger into discipline in the ring. Even before Freddie Roach, before worldwide fame, before the millions of dollars, it was Rodrigo who woke up at dawn to train young Manny in an improvised shed with punching bags made of fabric stuffed with sand. The old trainer had seen potential in that skinny, hungry boy, a rough diamond in the dusty streets of a forgotten city. Manny was paralyzed for a few seconds, the memory of those distant days flooding his mind like the rain that soaked the streets. He remembered the first punches, the patient corrections, the words of encouragement when everything seemed impossible. He remembered how Rodrigo would share his own lunch on days when he arrived at training without having eaten anything. How could this generous man, the one who believed in him when no one else did, now be reduced to begging on the streets? Manny's mind traveled to the past, to the moment when their paths separated. He was only 17 when he won his first important fight, attracting the attention of bigger managers who promised to take him to Manila, to more important fights, to a more promising future. In the excitement of youth and the urgency of poverty, Manny left, leaving behind the old shed and the trainer who didn't have the resources to accompany him on this new journey. The letters exchanged in the first few months soon became rare, and then ceased completely when Manny's career exploded internationally and he began working with Freddie Roach. Rodrigo remained seated, apparently unaware of who was watching him under the protection of the umbrella. The rain ran down his wrinkled face, mixing with the silent tears he tried to hide. Manny felt a lump in his throat. Years ago, those same hands that now trembled from cold had carefully wrapped his inexperienced hands, protecting them for future combats. That same voice, which now murmured requests for help to indifferent passers-by, had shouted precise instructions in the ring, celebrated his victories as if they were his own. Taking a deep breath to contain the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him, Manny finally moved closer, positioning the umbrella to protect the old trainer from the relentless rain. Rodrigo slowly raised his gaze, his tired eyes taking a few seconds to focus on the figure before him. There was no immediate recognition in his face, only the silent gratitude of someone receiving a small gesture of humanity after hours of indifference. His dry lips moved in an almost inaudible thank you under the noise of the rain. Manny couldn't respond immediately. How could he explain the whirlwind of emotions that ran through him at that moment? How to put into words the weight of guilt he suddenly felt for having lost contact with a man who had paved the first steps of his extraordinary journey? Instead of speaking, he sat down next to Rodrigo on the wet bench, completely ignoring that his expensive suit would be ruined by the water. At that moment, appearances and material possessions seemed insignificant in the face of the unexpected encounter with his past. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Finally, Manny found his voice, calling his former mentor by the nickname from the old days. The elderly man turned to him quickly, surprise etched on his face upon hearing that name that few still knew. His eyes, previously clouded by age and fatigue, widened in a mixture of confusion and growing recognition. His lower lip trembled slightly as he tried to articulate the name of his former pupil, as if fearing he was hallucinating. What followed was a moment of recognition that transcended words. The old trainer's eyes lit up with a clarity that had long disappeared, as he scrutinized the face of the man before him. Yes, it was him, his Manny, his prodigy, now transformed into a global icon, a respected and powerful man. The tears now running down Rodrigo's face had nothing to do with the rain that continued to fall. They were tears from a past that suddenly materialized before him, memories of a time when his dreams were still alive, when his work had purpose and meaning. Rodrigo's voice trembled as he finally recognized Manny, a mixture of disbelief and contained emotion. His wrinkled hands, which once molded the fists of a future champion, now extended hesitantly, as if fearing that the figure before him might be just a hallucination caused by fatigue and hunger. Manny grasped those hands firmly, feeling the old calluses that still persisted as silent witnesses to a life dedicated to boxing. Manny responded with emotion, respectfully calling him Coach, as in the old days. The title came naturally, as if the years hadn't passed, as if they were still in that old shed in General Santos, the young apprentice and his dedicated mentor. Looking closely, Manny noticed how much Rodrigo had aged. His face was marked by deep wrinkles, some formed by time, others certainly carved by hardships. His eyes, once alive and attentive to every movement in the ring, now seemed tired, partially clouded by incipient cataracts. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, but neither seemed to notice. They were trapped in a time bubble where past and present merged, where words seemed insufficient to express the abyss that years had created between them. Manny tried to say something, to explain his absence, to justify the forgetting, but the words died in his throat. How could he justify having lost contact with a man who had planted the seeds of his success? How to explain that, amid the vertigo of fame and fortune, he had forgotten to look back? Rodrigo seemed to read his thoughts, as a gentle smile formed on his dry lips. His eyes conveyed understanding as he squeezed his former pupil's hands. His gaze expressed that he always knew Manny would go far, much beyond what he could take him. There was a genuine absence of bitterness in his expression, only the pride of a teacher who sees his student exceed all expectations. That generosity of spirit, even amid evident adversity, only increased the guilt in Manny's heart. The old trainer began to cough violently, his fragile body shaking with the effort. Manny immediately put his arm around his shoulders, trying to better protect him with the umbrella. It was then that he realized how light Rodrigo was, practically skin and bones under the soaked clothes. Without thinking twice, he took off his own coat and placed it over the trembling shoulders of the elderly man, completely ignoring that the piece had cost more than many people earned in months. At that moment, the symbols of status and wealth seemed empty compared to the value of the life he was now trying to protect. With a gentleness rarely associated with a former boxer, Manny helped Rodrigo stand up from the bench. The old trainer seemed even smaller and more fragile standing, his posture curved by years of hardship and the invisible weight of disappointments. Manny indicated with a firm gesture that he would accompany him, not as a request, but as a decision already made. Rodrigo hesitated for a moment, his pride, the only thing that poverty hadn't completely taken away from him, fighting against the evident need. Rodrigo tried to resist, murmuring words of refusal, trying to maintain dignity even with soaked clothes and worn-out shoes. His eyes conveyed the explanation that he was only there because his medicine had run out and his pension would only arrive the following week. It was an attempt to preserve pride that both understood, but the worn clothes, extreme thinness, and the piece of cardboard begging for help told a different story. The story of someone who had fallen into deep and constant poverty. Ignoring the silent resistance, Manny gently guided his former mentor to the car waiting a few meters ahead. The driver, who was watching the scene from a distance, quickly got out to open the back door. His eyes widened momentarily at the state of the elderly man his boss was helping, but his expression soon returned to professional neutrality. For Rodrigo, however, the simple sight of the luxurious vehicle seemed to intensify his discomfort, making even more evident the abyss that now existed between him and his former pupil. Inside the car, protected from the rain and the noise of the city, a heavy silence settled. Rodrigo sat on the edge of the leather seat, as if fearing to soil it with his wet clothes. His wrinkled hands nervously twisted on his lap, and his eyes couldn't fix on a single point, alternating between admiration for the luxury around him and shame for his own condition. Manny observed these reactions with a heavy heart, remembering how he felt the first times he experienced a world of wealth and privilege that previously seemed unreachable to him. In an impulse, Manny covered Rodrigo's trembling hands with his own. His eyes conveyed emotion as he remembered how his former trainer had taught him to fight when he had nothing, how he had shared his food with him when he was hungry, how he had believed in him when even he didn't believe in himself. His gaze carried a late but sincere gratitude, expressing his desire to give back, even knowing he could never fully repay what he owed. Rodrigo's gaze finally met Manny's, and in that silent moment, decades of distance seemed to dissolve, revealing the deep connection between a master and his disciple that not even time and circumstances had managed to completely erase. The car glided smoothly through the streets of Manila, moving away from the city center toward a quieter residential neighborhood. Rodrigo watched through the window the changes in the urban landscape, the imposing buildings gradually giving way to elegant residences. The rain had decreased to a light drizzle, leaving the world outside with an almost dreamlike glow that matched the feeling of unreality the old trainer was experiencing. A few hours ago, he was sitting on a park bench, wet and hungry. Now he was in his former pupil's luxurious car, heading to an unknown destination. Manny had made a quick call, speaking softly to not be overheard. Sometimes he looked at Rodrigo with an expression that mixed concern and guilt. The old trainer closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of years and deprivation in every muscle of his tired body. There was a part of him that wanted to feel anger for the forgetting, for the abandonment, for the years of lonely struggle while he saw in newspapers and on television the meteoric success of his first champion. But this anger never managed to take deep roots in his heart. Instead, there was always pride, an almost paternal pride for having been a part, even if small, of the beginning of that extraordinary story. The car finally stopped in front of an elegant, but not ostentatious building. Manny gently indicated that they had arrived, as if fearing to disturb the thoughts of his former mentor. Rodrigo looked out the window, confused. It wasn't a hospital, as he had initially presumed, nor did it seem to be Manny's residence, which he imagined to be much more luxurious. It was an upper-middle-class residential building, well-maintained and with a discreet entrance, protected by a uniformed doorman. Rodrigo's questioning look met Manny's, the confusion evident in his weakened eyes. Manny smiled slightly before indicating with a gesture that this was an apartment he had bought a few years ago as an investment, which had been used by a cousin who had returned to General Santos the previous month, leaving it empty. Understanding slowly formed in Rodrigo's tired eyes, accompanied by a wave of emotion he tried to control. It wasn't just momentary charity that his former student was offering, it was a complete change in his circumstances, a new chance in life. Manny observed Rodrigo's reaction with barely disguised anxiety. He knew he was treading on delicate territory. Pride is often the last refuge of those who have lost almost everything in life, and he feared that his former trainer would reject the offer, preferring his miserable independence to help that could be interpreted as pity. Therefore, he chose his gestures and expressions carefully, suggesting with his look that Rodrigo stay there temporarily while they organized his medical treatment, indicating the security of the building and the proximity of one of the best hospitals in the city. Rodrigo remained silent for long seconds, the internal conflict clearly visible on his wrinkled face. Finally, with a deep sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he nodded slowly, his eyes expressing gratitude. That simple gesture carried the weight of decades of pride reluctantly set aside, of need finally recognized, of genuine gratitude for an unexpected act of kindness. Manny felt a lump in his throat, perfectly understanding how much that acceptance had cost the old warrior. The apartment was spacious and bright, decorated with elegant simplicity. Large windows allowed a partial view of the city, now blurred by the persistent drizzle. Rodrigo entered hesitantly, as if fearing that each wet step from his old shoes might stain the immaculate floor. Manny gently guided him through the rooms, showing the comfortable living room, the modern and well-equipped kitchen, the master bedroom with its king-size bed that seemed like an ocean of comfort to someone used to sleeping on a thin, worn mattress. Manny opened cabinets to show shelves full of supplies, indicating the abundance of food in the refrigerator and pantries. He also pointed to the table where he had left his number and his assistance, for any need that might arise. There was an almost childlike anxiety in his gestures, as if he were desperate to compensate for years of absence with this single act. Rodrigo noticed this and felt an almost paternal tenderness for the man before him, this powerful and famous man who, at that moment, seemed again the insecure boy who sought approval in his eyes after each training session. In a sudden movement that surprised even himself, Rodrigo extended his hand and touched Manny's face, a gesture he used to make decades ago, when his young pupil needed encouragement before a difficult fight. His eyes contained emotion, while his expression indicated that everything was perfect, more than he could ever have dreamed. That simple touch, that familiar gesture from the past, broke down the last barriers between them. Manny felt hot tears running down his face and made no effort to hide or contain them. For a long moment, they remained like this, united by the memory of a simpler time, when one trained the other to fight, not knowing that they were, in fact, preparing the ground for this reunion decades later. It was the sound of a notification on Manny's cell phone that finally broke the moment. Reluctantly, he checked the message, and his expression changed. There was an important vote in the Senate that afternoon, and he needed to be present. The disappointment was evident in his eyes. Rodrigo nodded understandingly, his gaze assuring that he would be fine. Before leaving, Manny hesitated at the door, as if there was something more that needed to be expressed. His gaze carried emotion as he tried to convey how many people had helped him get where he was. Great trainers, powerful businessmen, influential politicians. But his expression emphasized that Rodrigo was the first to believe in him when he was nothing, a debt he could never fully repay. Rodrigo smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated his tired face. His look conveyed a simple but profound truth. A teacher doesn't plant a seed expecting it to bear fruit only for him. We plant for the world, for the future. With that silent message still hanging in the air, Manny departed, promising with a gesture to return the next day. Rodrigo closed the door and stood motionless for a few moments, absorbing the comfortable silence of the apartment, so different from the constant noise of the streets where he had lived in recent years. Slowly, he made his way to the luxurious bathroom, where he encountered his own image in the wide mirror. A worn-out old man looked back at him, but there was something different in his eyes now, a brightness that had disappeared a long time ago, a spark of renewed hope. 3 months had passed since that rainy day in Manila. The transformation in Rodrigo's life was almost miraculous. Under the care of the best doctors, personally hired by Manny, his health improved considerably. Proper nutrition returned some weight to his formerly skeletal body, and the treatment for his cataracts and respiratory problems progressed promisingly. But the most notable change wasn't physical. It was the gradual return of his dignity, of his purpose in life. Manny visited whenever he could, often bringing his family. His children loved hearing Rodrigo's stories about their father's early fighting days, about how determined he was even when he had nothing. These moments were precious to Manny, who watched with contained emotion the way his children, born in privilege, attentively listened to Rodrigo's lessons of humility and perseverance. It was as if a cycle was completing itself, as if an essential part of his own history, almost lost in the whirlwind of success, was being recovered and preserved through these interactions. On a sunny Saturday morning, Manny arrived alone at the apartment, carrying a mysterious package. Rodrigo welcomed him with a smile, immediately noticing the enigmatic expression on his former pupil's face. Rodrigo's questioning look was answered when Manny simply handed over the package. With slightly trembling hands, Rodrigo unwrapped it, revealing a pair of new, shiny training gloves, along with hand wraps. Manny indicated with a gesture that there was something he wanted to show him. Confused, Rodrigo followed him to the waiting car. They traveled in silence through the city until they reached a developing neighborhood on the outskirts of Manila. The car stopped in front of a new building, still with scaffolding on some external parts. A large sign partially covered the facade, Pacquiao Buena Vista Boxing Academy, coming soon. The surprise left Rodrigo momentarily speechless. His eyes, now clearer after cataract surgery, incredulously scanned the image on the sign, a photograph of him and Manny, side by side, from decades ago, enlarged and stylized. Manny anxiously observed his reaction, like a child waiting for approval after presenting a drawing. His gestures explained that the academy would be mainly for poor children, offering not only boxing training, but also food, school support, and medical assistance. His gaze suggested that Rodrigo could supervise the trainers, sharing his experience. Rodrigo remained silent, but the tears now freely flowing down his face spoke more than words could express. It wasn't just a job or an occupation that Manny was offering, it was the chance to revive his original purpose, to transmit his knowledge to a new generation, to transform lives as he once transformed the life of a hungry boy from General Santos City. It was the realization of a dream he had abandoned years ago, when poverty and circumstances had seemed to crush all possibilities. With slow but determined steps, Rodrigo walked to the entrance of the building. Manny followed in respectful silence, understanding the magnitude of the moment. As they reached the glass doors, still covered with protective plastic, Rodrigo turned to face his former pupil, now his partner in this new venture. There was no more hierarchy between them, only mutual respect, reciprocal gratitude, and a shared commitment to something greater than both. His eyes shone with determination, conveying the message that they would build champions, not just in the ring, but in life. His firm and clear gaze echoed through the years to that dusty shed where it all began. And so, under the bright sun of Manila, two men separated by generations and experiences, but united by a common passion and an indestructible bond, took the first steps into a future that honored the past while opening new paths. The circle was complete. The lesson of generosity, first planted by a poor trainer in a hungry boy, now bore abundant fruits that would feed many other lives hungry for opportunity and hope. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.